Hello, 911.
Por favor, rápido, rápido. It's an emergency. He has a gun.
I'm sorry, what's going on?
There's a guy, he's the father of my little brother, and he's trying to kill my mom. He has a gun.
Okay. How old are you?
Not fast.
Wait,
I'm 12.
Okay. We have everyone on the way. Is this guy inside or outside?
He's outside and he has my mom.
What happens when kids find out that the people meant to protect them are the ones hurting other children? Today, we explore the stories of these kids who didn't just witness crime. They stood up to it, even when the criminals were the people they loved most, their parents. From cases of children who turned in serial killers, to those who secretly recorded their parents committing crimes, these stories remind us that courage sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. Each act of bravery reveals the painful line between loyalty and justice, and how doing what's right can come at the highest emotional cost. Before we start the countdown, click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our detailed crime documentaries. On number 10, we have April Balascio, who turned in her father, Edward Wayne Edwards, who was a serial killer. The daughter who caught her serial killer father. April Balascio grew up knowing something was wrong with her father. She just didn't know how wrong until decades later. Her father was Edward Wayne Edwards, a man who seemed to constantly be running from something. The family moved all the time. New towns, new schools, new names. April never understood why they had to keep moving, but her father always had an explanation. A new job opportunity, a fresh start, better schools for the kids. As a child, April pushed these thoughts away. He was her father. Yes, he was difficult. Yes, he scared her sometimes. But she couldn't allow herself to think the unthinkable. April grew up, got married, and started a family of her own. She moved away from her father and tried to build a normal life. But the questions never left her. They lived in the back of her mind, growing stronger as the years passed. Then one day in 2009, April was looking at old photographs. She came across pictures from when her family had lived in Wisconsin in 1980. Something clicked in her memory. She remembered that summer. She remembered a young couple who had disappeared from a wedding reception near where they lived. The case had been all over the news. Tim Hack and Kelly Drew were their names. They were 19 and 18 years old, engaged to be married. They went to a friend's wedding reception on August 9, 1980. After the reception, they disappeared. 3 months later, their bodies were found in a cornfield. They had been murdered. April remembered her father's obsession with the case. She remembered how closely he followed every news report. She remembered the questions he asked, the theories he shared with the family, and she remembered something else. Her family had left Wisconsin very suddenly not long after those bodies were found. April sat with these memories for months. She told herself she was being ridiculous, but the questions wouldn't go away. She started researching other places her family had lived. She looked up murders and disappearances from those towns from the times when they lived there. A pattern began to emerge. In town after town, there were unsolved murders. Young couples, mostly. And in almost every case, her family had moved away shortly after. In 2009, April made the hardest decision of her life. She called the police in Wisconsin. Her hands shook as she dialed. She told the detective she had information about the murders of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew. She told him about her father, about the pattern of moves, about his strange behavior. She gave them her father's name, Edward Wayne Edwards. The detective on the other end of the line listened carefully. He took notes. He asked questions. And then he told April they would look into it. Her father's name would be checked against their evidence. April hung up the phone and waited. She had just accused her own father of murder. If she was wrong, she would have destroyed her relationship with him for nothing. But if she was right, her father was a monster who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The detectives in Wisconsin took April's tips seriously. They pulled out the old case files for Tim Hack and Kelly Drew. They looked at Edward Wayne Edwards' background. What they found shocked them. Edwards wasn't just some regular guy with a troubled past. He had a criminal record going back decades. Robbery, burglary, escape from custody. He had even written a book in the 1970s about his life of crime and supposed redemption. The book was called Metamorphosis of a Criminal. In it, Edwards claimed he had turned his life around and become a good citizen. They focused on the Wisconsin murders first. They had DNA evidence from the crime scene that had been preserved for nearly 30 years. With April's cooperation, they were able to get a DNA sample from Edwards. They ran the comparison. It was a match. On June 30th, 2009, police arrested Edward Wayne Edwards at his home in Kentucky. He was 76 years old. When they told him he was being charged with the murders of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, Edwards denied everything. But the DNA evidence didn't lie. As investigators dug deeper into Edwards' life, more victims emerged. In Ohio, there was a double murder from 1977. William Lavaco and Judith Straub, a young couple found shot to death. Edwards had been living in the area at the time. He eventually confessed to these murders too. Then there was the case of Danny Boy Edwards. In 1996, the badly decomposed body of a young man was found in Ohio. For years, he remained unidentified, known only as Danny Boy. It turned out this was Edwards' own foster son. Edwards had killed him and dumped his body. Edwards also confessed to killing his own wife in 1961. He pushed her down the stairs and made it look like an accident. With each confession, the true scope of Edward Wayne Edwards' crimes became clear. He had been killing for decades. He had moved from town to town, leaving bodies behind him. And he had done it all while raising a family, while writing a book about redemption, while presenting himself to the world as a reformed criminal trying to do better. In 2010, Edward Wayne Edwards pleaded guilty to the murders of Tim Hack, Kelly Drew, William Lavaco, and Judith Straub. He was sentenced to death. He never showed remorse. In interviews, he was cold and calculating, seeming almost proud of what he had done. Edwards died in prison in 2011 while awaiting execution. He was 77 years old. Even at the end, he maintained that there were more victims, crimes that police would never be able to pin on him. After his death, investigators continued to look into Edwards as a suspect in other unsolved cases. Some believe his victim count could be much higher than the 5 confirmed murders. He had spent decades traveling across the country. Who knows how many bodies he left behind? But April also gave justice to families who had been waiting decades for answers. Tim Hack's mother said that April was brave for coming forward. She thanked her for giving them answers, for giving them peace. April's decision to turn in her father came at a tremendous personal cost. She lost her father because she chose justice over family loyalty. Number 9. Jackson Reffitt, who recorded and alerted FBI about his father Guy Reffitt. Jackson Reffitt was just 18 years old when he made a decision that would change his life forever. He picked up his phone, opened the FBI tip line, and reported his own father. The date was January 6, 2021. The whole country had just watched as a mob stormed the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Thousands of people had broken through barriers, fought with police officers, and forced their way into the building while Congress was meeting inside. The images were shocking: windows smashed, doors broken down. People wandering through the halls of one of America's most important government buildings. Jackson had watched it all on television from his home in Texas, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that his father was there. Guy Reffitt was a proud member of a militia group called the Texas 3 Percenters. For months leading up to January 6th, he had been talking about going to Washington. He talked about protecting the country. He talked about stopping Congress from certifying the election results. He talked about taking action. On January 6th, Jackson watched the news coverage. He saw the violence. He saw people attacking police officers. He saw the chaos and destruction. And somewhere in that crowd, he knew his father was there. When Guy Reffitt came home to Texas a few days later, he was different. He was angry that more hadn't been accomplished. He talked about what he had done at the Capitol. He bragged about being at the front of the mob. He talked about what should have happened, what could have happened if people had just pushed harder. Then he said something that made Jackson's blood run cold. Guy Reffitt looked at his children and told them that if they ever reported him, if they ever turned him into authorities, they would be traitors. And traitors, he said, get shot. He wasn't joking. His voice was serious. His eyes were hard. This was a threat. Jackson's younger sister was there too. She was only 16. They both heard their father threaten them. They both understood what he meant. For Jackson, this was the moment everything changed. This wasn't just about politics anymore. This wasn't just about his father's beliefs. His father had participated in an attack on the Capitol. He had broken the law. And now he was threatening his own children to keep them quiet. Jackson started recording his father. He would set his phone to record during conversations. He captured his father talking about what happened on January 6th. He captured the threats. He captured everything. In one recording, Guy Reffitt talked about being at the front of the mob at the Capitol. He talked about the gun he had carried. He talked about the violence. He seemed proud of what he had done. The FBI took Jackson's report seriously. They opened an investigation into Guy Reffitt. They looked at video footage from the Capitol and found Guy in multiple videos. They saw him at the front of the mob. They saw him on the steps of the Capitol. The evidence was overwhelming. Guy Reffitt had traveled to Washington with weapons. He had worn tactical gear and a helmet with a camera mounted on it. He had filmed himself during the attack. He had pushed toward the Capitol building alongside the mob. He had confronted police officers. On January 16, 2021, just 10 days after the Capitol attack, FBI agents came to the Reffitt home in Texas. They arrested Guy Reffitt and took him into custody. The family was torn apart in an instant. Jackson's mother was furious. She couldn't believe that her son had turned in his own father. How could he do this to the family? How could he betray his father like this? Jackson's younger sister struggled with what was happening. Their father was gone, arrested, and facing serious charges. The family was divided. Guy Reffitt's trial began in March 2022, more than a year after the Capitol attack. He was charged with multiple crimes, including obstruction of an official proceeding, being unlawfully present on restricted Capitol grounds while armed with a firearm, and obstruction of justice for threatening his children. The prosecution built their case using video evidence from the Capitol, Guy Reffitt's own recorded statements, and testimony from witnesses. But the most powerful evidence came from his own son. Jackson Reffitt testified in court. He sat in the witness stand and told the jury what his father had done. He explained why he had reported him to the FBI. He talked about the threats his father had made. It wasn't easy. Jackson had to look at his father across the courtroom and tell the truth about what he had done. He had to relive the moment when his father threatened him and his sister. He had to face the anger from his mother and other family members who saw him as a traitor, but Jackson stood firm. He answered every question. He provided the recordings he had made. He gave the jury a clear picture of what his father had done and said. The defense tried to paint Guy Reffitt as someone who had just gotten caught up in the moment, someone who made bad decisions but wasn't really dangerous. They tried to minimize his actions at the Capitol, but the evidence was too strong. The videos showed Guy Reffitt at the front of the mob, confronting police. The recordings showed him bragging about what he had done and threatening his children. His own words convicted him. On March 8, 2022, the jury found Guy Reffitt guilty on all charges. He became the first person to go to trial and be convicted for crimes related to the January 6th Capitol attack. In August 2022, Guy Reffitt was sentenced to more than 7 years in federal prison. It was one of the longest sentences handed down for January 6th cases at that time. The judge noted that Guy Reffitt had not only participated in the attack on the Capitol, but had also threatened his own children to try to cover it up. Those threats made his crimes even more serious. For Jackson Reffitt, the trial and conviction brought a strange kind of relief mixed with deep sadness. He had done what he believed was right. He had reported a crime. He had told the truth in court. But the cost was enormous. His relationship with his mother was damaged. She stood by her husband and couldn't forgive Jackson for what he had done. Other family members took sides. Some supported Jackson's decision. Others viewed him as someone who had destroyed the family. Jackson had to live with the knowledge that his father would spend years in prison, partly because of evidence he had provided. He had to live with being called a traitor by his own mother. He had to live with the weight of that decision every single day. In interviews after the trial, Jackson explained why he did it. He said he couldn't stay silent. His father had participated in an attack on the Capitol. He had broken the law. And then he had threatened his own children to try to escape consequences for what he had done. Jackson said it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about taking sides in arguments about the election or anything else. It was about right and wrong. It was about holding someone accountable for their actions, even if that someone was your own father. Guy Reffitt is currently serving his sentence in federal prison. His relationship with his son may never recover. The family Jackson grew up and no longer exists in the same way it did before January 6, 2021. Number 8. Elisabeth Fritzl, who escaped and exposed her father Josef Fritzl. In April 2008, a 19-year-old woman named Kirsten Fritzl was brought to a hospital in Austria. She was unconscious and critically ill. The doctors had never seen anything like it. Her teeth were rotting. Her body showed signs of severe malnutrition. She looked like someone who had been deprived of basic care for years. When the doctors asked her family what had happened, the answers didn't make sense. Her grandfather, Josef Fritzl, said she had appeared at his doorstep with a note from her mother. But where was the mother? Why hadn't she brought her daughter to the hospital herself? Why was this young woman in such terrible condition? The doctors were suspicious. They asked Josef to bring Kirsten's mother to the hospital. They needed to speak with her urgently. Josef agreed and left. What happened next would expose one of the most horrifying crimes in modern history. Josef Fritzl went home to his house in the town of Amstetten, Austria. It was a normal-looking house on a quiet street. He had lived there for decades with his wife Rosemarie. They had raised 7 children in that house. But beneath that ordinary home was a secret that Josef had kept for 24 years. Hidden behind a heavy door in the basement was another door, reinforced and locked. Behind that door was a cellar. And in that cellar, Josef's daughter Elisabeth had been living since 1984. She was 42 years old now. For 24 years, she had been trapped underground. She had never seen sunlight. She had never breathed fresh air. She had never been free. When Josef came down to the cellar that day in April 2008, he told Elisabeth something that would change everything. He said that Kirsten was very sick. The hospital needed to see Elisabeth immediately. After all these years of keeping her hidden, Josef was going to let her out. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to 1984. Elisabeth Fritzl was 18 years old. She had grown up in that house in Amstetten. Her childhood had not been happy. Her father Josef was strict and controlling. He had clear rules about what his children could and couldn't do. Elisabeth wanted to escape. She wanted to train as a waitress and live her own life. But Josef had other plans. He had been building something in the basement, a hidden cellar, a prison. On August 28, 1984, Josef asked Elisabeth to help him install a door in the basement. When she went down to help, he attacked her. He drugged her with ether-soaked cloth. When she woke up, she was chained in the cellar. The door was locked. And her father told her she would never leave. Elisabeth screamed. She begged. She tried to escape, but the cellar was soundproof. The door was reinforced. No one could hear her. No one came to help. Her mother Rosemarie asked Josef where Elisabeth was. Josef had an answer ready. He told his wife that Elisabeth had run away to join a cult. He even produced letters supposedly written by Elisabeth, saying she was fine and didn't want to be contacted. Rosemarie believed him. Everyone believed him. But Elisabeth hadn't run away. She was right below their feet, trapped in a dungeon her father had built. For 24 years, Elisabeth lived in that cellar. It was small, dark, and damp. At first it was just a few rooms. Over the years, Josef expanded it, making it bigger. But it was still a prison. Josef controlled everything. He controlled when the lights were on or off. He controlled what Elisabeth ate. He controlled when she could shower. He held complete power over her life. And he did something even worse. He repeatedly assaulted his own daughter. Over the years, Elisabeth became pregnant 7 times. She gave birth to 7 children in that cellar. She delivered those babies alone, with no medical help, no doctors, no pain relief. Some of those births almost killed her. Of the 7 children, 1 died shortly after birth. The other 6 children survived. 3 of them, Josef decided to keep in the cellar with Elisabeth. He told his wife Rosemarie that Elisabeth had abandoned these babies on their doorstep, leaving notes asking her parents to raise them. Incredibly, Rosemarie believed this story. She and Josef became legal guardians of these 3 children and raised them upstairs in the house. Felix, Stefan, and Kirsten spent their entire childhoods underground. They knew their mother Elisabeth, but they thought Josef was a good man who brought them food and supplies. They didn't understand that he was their father, their captor, and the cause of all their suffering. In 2008, Kirsten was 19 years old. She had lived her entire life in the cellar. She had never been to a doctor. She had never received any medical care. When she became seriously ill, Elisabeth begged Josef to help her daughter. At first, Josef refused, but Kirsten got worse. She was unconscious. She was dying. Finally, Josef realized he had no choice. If Kirsten died in the cellar, he would have another body to dispose of, and this time she was too big to burn in the furnace. So Josef brought Kirsten to the hospital. He left her there with a note supposedly from Elisabeth. Then he went home and did something he hadn't done in 24 years. He brought Elisabeth out of the cellar. When Elisabeth emerged from that basement, she stepped into a world that had changed completely. It was 2008. When she went down into that cellar, it was 1984. She had missed 24 years of life. She had been 19 years old when she disappeared. Now she was 42. Josef took Elisabeth to the hospital. He probably thought he could control the situation, that he could explain everything away like he always had. But this time, something was different. This time the doctors had questions. This time people were paying attention. At the hospital, doctors spoke with Elisabeth. They could tell something was very wrong. She was pale, almost ghost-like. She seemed terrified. She flinched at loud noises. Her behavior was unusual. The police were called. They separated Elisabeth from Josef. And finally, after 24 years, Elisabeth told someone the truth. She told them everything. The cellar, the captivity, the children, all of it. Police immediately went to the Fritzl house. They searched the basement and found the hidden cellar. They found Felix and Stefan still down there, pale and frightened. The boys were 5 and 18 years old. They had never been outside. Josef Fritzl was arrested. At first, he denied everything. But the evidence was overwhelming. The cellar was real. The children were real. DNA tests proved he was their father. Elisabeth's testimony was clear and detailed. Eventually, Josef confessed. But even in his confession, he tried to minimize what he had done. He claimed he had saved Elisabeth from a bad crowd. He claimed he had taken care of her. He showed no real remorse for what he had done. Josef Fritzl's trial began in March 2009. The charges against him included imprisonment, assault, enslavement, and the murder of baby Michael, who had died in the cellar. The evidence was presented. The horror of what Elisabeth and her children had endured became public knowledge. The world was shocked. How could this happen? How could a man keep his own daughter imprisoned for 24 years in a cellar beneath his house? How could his wife not know? How could neighbors not suspect anything? Josef sat in the courtroom showing little emotion. He was 73 years old, a grandfather, a seemingly ordinary man. In March 2009, Josef Fritzl was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge said he had shown no mercy to his victims, and he would receive none from the court. For Elisabeth and her children, the nightmare was over, but recovery would take years. The 3 children who had been raised upstairs by Rosemary now learned the truth. The grandmother they loved had unknowingly raised them, while their mother and siblings were imprisoned below. Their grandfather was actually their father, and he had done terrible things. The children from the cellar had to adjust to life above ground. They had to learn about the world. Simple things like sunlight hurt their eyes. They had to learn social skills. They had to begin years of therapy to process the trauma of what they had lived through. Elisabeth herself faced an unimaginable journey of recovery. She had lost 24 years of her life. She had endured constant trauma. She had raised 3 children in a dungeon. She had given birth alone 7 times. She had watched one of her babies die. Austrian authorities gave Elisabeth and her children new identities. They moved to a secret location where they could begin rebuilding their lives away from media attention. Elisabeth was reunited with all 6 of her surviving children. The house in Amstetten was eventually demolished. The cellar where Elisabeth spent 24 years was filled with concrete. The town wanted to erase the physical reminder of what had happened there. Josef Fritzl remains in prison. He is now in his late 80s. He has asked to be released several times, claiming he is old and sick. Each time, his requests have been denied. He will likely die in prison, which is exactly what he deserves. Rosemary Fritzl divorced Josef after the truth came out. She maintains that she had no idea what was happening in her own basement. Some people believe her. Others find it hard to imagine how she could have missed the signs for 24 years. Elisabeth Fritzl's story is one of unimaginable horror, but it's also a story of incredible strength. For 24 years, she survived in conditions that would have broken most people. She raised 3 children in a dungeon, keeping them alive and giving them hope even when she had none herself. And when she finally had the chance to speak the truth, she did. She could have stayed silent out of fear or shame. She could have protected her father, as victims of family abuse sometimes do. But instead, she told the police everything. She testified against him. She made sure he faced justice for what he had done. Josef Fritzl stole 24 years from his daughter. He stole her youth, her freedom, and her chance at a normal life. But he didn't break her. Elisabeth survived. She brought him to justice, and she rebuilt a life for herself and her children. Today, Elisabeth lives in privacy with her children. They have chosen to stay out of the public eye, which is completely understandable. They deserve peace and privacy after everything they endured. Number 7. John Franzese Jr., who cooperated with authorities and testified against his father, a high-ranking mafia figure. In 2010, a federal courtroom in Brooklyn witnessed something that had never happened before in New York mob history. A son was about to testify against his father. Not just any father, but John Sonny Franzese, a legendary underboss of the Colombo crime family who had spent decades as one of the most feared men in organized crime. As John Jr. began his testimony, his 93-year-old father sat at the defense table. Sonny Franzese was so old and frail that he kept falling asleep during the proceedings. But when he was awake, he showed no emotion. He didn't look angry. He didn't look hurt. He just sat there, listening to his son betray him in the most public way possible. John Franzese Jr. was born into the mob. His father, Sonny, wasn't just connected to organized crime. He was one of its most powerful figures. Sonny Franzese had been with the Colombo family since the 1950s. By the time John Jr. was born, his father was already a legend on the streets of New York. Sonny was known for being tough, smart, and absolutely ruthless. Prosecutors claimed he had killed between 30 and 50 people during his career, though he was never convicted of murder. He knew Frank Sinatra. He had investments in the adult entertainment industry. He ran gambling operations, loan sharking rings, and extortion rackets. He was everything a mobster was supposed to be. For John Jr., this meant growing up in a world where violence and crime were normal. His father was frequently arrested. He spent years in prison. When he was out, he was always working, always scheming, always involved in something illegal. John Jr. tried to follow in his father's footsteps. He became an associate of the Colombo family. He learned the business. He learned the rules. And the most important rule of all was omerta, the code of silence. You never cooperate with law enforcement. You never testify against family. You go to prison before you become a rat. But John Jr.'s life in the mob wasn't going well. He developed a serious drug problem. He became addicted to crack cocaine. His life was falling apart. The FBI saw an opportunity. They approached John Jr. with a proposition. They knew about his drug problems. They knew about his connection to his father. They knew he was vulnerable. They offered him a way out. Become an informant. Wear a wire. Record conversations with your father. Help us build a case against the Colombo family. For John Jr., this was an impossible decision. Everything in his life, everything he had been taught, said you don't cooperate with the FBI. You don't betray your father. You don't become a rat. That's the worst thing you can be in the mob world. But John Jr. was tired. He was tired of the drugs. He was tired of the violence. He was tired of living in fear. He was tired of his father's world. And maybe most importantly, he wanted out. In 2005, John Franzese Jr. agreed to become an FBI informant. He would wear a wire and record his conversations with his father. For months, John Jr. wore a recording device whenever he met with his father. He captured hundreds of hours of conversations. Sonny Franzese talked about mob business. He talked about extortion schemes. He talked about shaking down strip clubs and pizzerias for protection money. He talked about the family's operations. John Jr. captured it all. But there was a moment when everything almost fell apart. Sonny Franzese began to suspect his son was cooperating with authorities. Someone had told him that John Jr. might be wearing a wire. Sonny confronted his son. John Jr. did something remarkable. He looked his father in the eye and lied. He cried. He told his father he would never betray him, no matter what kind of trouble he was in. He said all the right things. And Sonny believed him. He welcomed his son back into his confidence. And John Jr. kept recording. During this time, another informant recorded Sonny discussing what should be done about his son if the betrayal was real. The conversation suggested Sonny had considered having John Jr. killed for cooperating with authorities. But nothing ever came of it. In 2010, federal prosecutors charged Sonny Franzese with racketeering, conspiracy, and loan sharking. The star witness was his own son. John Franzese Jr. became the first son of a New York mobster to turn state's evidence and testify against his father. The trial was a media sensation. Here was Sonny Franzese, a 93-year-old mob legend, being taken down by his own flesh and blood. The man who had survived decades in organized crime, who had beaten numerous criminal charges over the years, was now facing his son in court. John Jr. testified about the recordings he had made. He explained what his father had said. He provided context for the conversations. He gave prosecutors everything they needed. The defense tried to attack John Jr.'s credibility. They pointed out his drug addiction. They called him a liar. They tried to paint him as someone who would say anything to get a deal from the FBI, but the recordings spoke for themselves. Sonny's own words convicted him. In July 2010, the jury found Sonny Franzese guilty on racketeering and loan sharking charges. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. For a man who was already 93 years old, this was essentially a life sentence. After the trial, John Franzese Jr. went into witness protection. He had to leave New York. He had to start a new life with a new identity. He had become the worst thing you can be in the mob world. A rat, a traitor, someone who broke omerta. His relationship with his father was destroyed. The mob world hated him. Even some people outside the mob looked at what he did with disgust. How could a son do that to his father? How could he send his own father to prison? But John Jr. had made his choice. He believed it was the right thing to do. His father had lived a life of crime for decades. He had hurt people. He had broken the law. And John Jr. had decided that family loyalty didn't mean protecting someone who did terrible things. Sonny Franzese served his sentence. Against all odds, he survived. In 2017, at the age of 100 years old, he was released from prison. He had become the oldest federal inmate in the United States. He went home to New York and lived quietly until his death in February 2020 at the age of 103. Before Sonny died, something unexpected happened. John Jr. reached out to his father. They met, and Sonny did something that shocked many people. He forgave his son. After everything that had happened, after the betrayal and the testimony and the prison sentence, Sonny Franzese forgave John Jr. for what he had done. John Jr. later said that forgiveness meant everything to him. It didn't undo what had happened. It didn't change the fact that he had testified against his father. But it gave him something he desperately needed: peace. John Franzese Jr. remains the first son of a New York mobster to turn state's evidence and testify against his father. His decision changed his life forever. He can never go back to New York. He can never return to the life he knew. He lost his family, his identity, and his place in the world. Number 6. Jordan Turpin, the girl who saved her siblings. On January 14, 2018, a 17-year-old girl named Jordan Turpin did something that terrified her. She climbed out of her bedroom window in Paris, California, and started walking down the street. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She had only been outside a handful of times in her entire life. But Jordan kept walking, because back at the house, her siblings were chained to their beds. And if she didn't do something, they would stay chained there forever. Jordan pulled out a deactivated cell phone that her parents didn't know she had. She had been planning this moment for years. She dialed 911. When the operator answered, Jordan's voice trembled. She told the operator that she had escaped from her house. She said her parents were abusive. She said some of her siblings were chained up right now. The operator could barely understand her at first. Jordan had rarely spoken to anyone outside her family. She didn't know how to explain what was happening. She didn't even know her own address, but she kept talking. And within minutes, police cars were on their way. The police arrived at the Turpin family home expecting to find something bad. What they found was far worse than anything they could have imagined. Inside the house were 12 more Turpin children. Some were chained to their beds with padlocks. The house was filthy. It smelled terrible. There was garbage everywhere. The children were malnourished and weak. Some of them could barely walk. The oldest child in the house was 29 years old. She weighed only 82 pounds. She looked like a young teenager because of severe malnutrition. Several of the younger children appeared to be 7 or 8 years old. They were actually teenagers. Starvation had stunted their growth so dramatically that they looked like small children. The police officers who entered that house that day would later say it was the worst case of child abuse they had ever seen. One officer broke down and cried when she saw the conditions those children were living in. David and Louise Turpin, Jordan's parents, were arrested that morning. As they were being led away in handcuffs, Jordan watched from the back of a police car. After 17 years of living in fear, her nightmare was finally over. Jordan Turpin had been born into captivity. From the time she was a baby, her life had been controlled by her parents in ways that most people can't imagine. David and Louise Turpin had 13 children. To the outside world, they tried to appear like a normal, happy family. They posted photos on social media showing everyone smiling. They even went to Las Vegas and renewed their wedding vows in an Elvis-themed ceremony with all the children present. The photos from that day show kids in matching outfits, everyone looking clean and happy. But behind closed doors, the Turpin house was a prison. The children were allowed to eat only one meal a day. Sometimes they would go days without food. They were allowed to shower only once a year. They weren't allowed to go to school or see doctors. They weren't allowed to have friends. They weren't allowed to play outside. As she got older, Jordan began to understand that what was happening to her wasn't normal. She had occasionally seen glimpses of the outside world. She had seen how other families lived. She realized her parents were hurting her and her siblings. Jordan started thinking about escape. Her older sister Jennifer helped her plan. Together, they worked on a strategy for years. Jordan would be the one to escape and call for help. Jennifer would stay behind to protect the younger children until help arrived. On that morning in January 2018, Jordan knew it was time. She had been preparing for this moment. She had found the deactivated cell phone that could still dial 911. She had practiced what she would say. Her sister Jennifer had tried to draw her a map of the neighborhood based on the few times they had been allowed outside. Police discovered that David and Louise Turpin had been torturing their children for years. The abuse had started in Texas before the family moved to California. It had continued for decades, getting progressively worse as the number of children grew. The evidence was overwhelming. Photos showed the children chained to beds. Medical examinations revealed the extent of the malnutrition and physical abuse. The children themselves testified about years of torture, starvation, and imprisonment. David and Louise Turpin were charged with multiple counts of torture, false imprisonment, child abuse, and dependent adult abuse. Faced with undeniable evidence, they both pleaded guilty. In April 2019, David and Louise Turpin were sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The judge called their crimes depraved and said they had shown no remorse for what they had done to their own children. For Jordan and her siblings, freedom came with enormous challenges. They had to learn how to live in the world. Simple things that most people take for granted were completely new to them. They had to learn about shopping, cooking, using money, making friends, going to school. Jordan had to learn how to read properly. She had to learn math. She had to learn social skills. Everything was new and often overwhelming. But Jordan was determined to build a real life for herself. In the years since her escape, Jordan has spoken publicly about her experience. She has appeared in interviews and documentaries. She has been honest about both the horrors of her childhood and the difficulties of recovery. Today, Jordan Turpin is in her 20s. She is building a life for herself. She has experienced freedom and sunlight and the normal things that most young people take for granted. She has friends, she has dreams, she has a future. Her parents remain in prison where they will likely spend the rest of their lives. 5. Jordan Turpin, the girl who saved her siblings. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, tap subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video. Drop a comment. Which moment hit you hardest and why? Your voice helps these cases reach more people. This documentary is for educational and awareness purposes. We honor the victims and survivors. Please be respectful in the comments. Part 2 drops next. Stay brave. Stay informed.